Good afternoon or evening, whenever you're watching this. I just wanted to share a few thoughts with you for this Sunday. I heard John MacArthur speaking this week on a political talk show that I listen to. Don't want to get into politics right now. What he talked about was fascinating to me that I've never heard it discussed this way about why is it that we see our society going the direction it's going? Why does it appear as though so quickly we have lost our footing as a society? However you want to look at that. It's always true that man has a sinful nature. There's no doubt about that. We can understand that completely. Um, we can understand that this world is clearly right now being influenced, or at all times been influenced by Satan and his ways. The world system obviously lends to that. But what's interesting is when you look at our society here in the United States, we've gone from um, you. I think you could argue anyway, in the not too distant past, we were had a moral compass that seemed to be more aligned with God and His ways. And it seems as though recently um, we have departed from that in such a rapid pace. Why? What has been going on for that to happen? Or has it happened? Has it happened that rapidly? And maybe it hasn't happened. It's just been a gradual thing, which is a very easy to argue that as well. But what I heard John MacArthur talk about, and I've heard these things put this way before, but never as succinctly, and so I kind of just want to share a little bit with my own thoughts intermixed in here. Um, the four things that we see in Scripture that are supposed to restrain society from becoming this far bent away from God. And when we look at those four restraints and we look at those things, and then you see where we in the US right now anyway have rejected any kind of biblical thought towards those things, I think it makes a lot more sense why we are where we are today. And so I want to share with you, and this is definitely not my original thoughts at all. Okay, I'm going to say that right up front. But I hope this will spur some thoughts in your mind, and then also my other point I want to make here tonight is, what do we do about it? How do we as the church go about righting the ship, if you will? Is it possible? Um, so, the first one that he talked about was a personal restraint. Let's call that the conscience. Isn't it an amazing thing that God has given to us His law written on our hearts? That has always amazed me when we think about that way. Romans chapter 2, verse 14. When we read that passage, here's what we see. For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. Now, when you read that, Paul is making the argument here that all of us are guilty, okay? All of us are guilty of the law, and he's showing it that the Gentiles, simply by obeying the law that they've never been taught, when they follow law if they've never been taught, it shows that God has given them that law. They have the law written on their heart. God has given every single one of us the understanding. Doesn't matter where you live, doesn't matter what kind of culture you were brought up in, doesn't matter if you darkened the doorsteps of a church or not before. God has given each and every individual the ability to know what is right and wrong. Now, maybe not to the fullest extent that we have in God's Word for us as believers that are maturing in Him. But the reality is that we all know right from wrong. It's why when you look at a little 2-year-old and they know that they're doing wrong, what do? They look back to see if anybody's watching. Because they know. They know that they're sneaking around. They know they're doing wrong. God's given that to us. The conscience is the first step to restrain this rapid departure away from God and His way. So when you think about that today, okay, what has man done with the conscience? Now, think about this. When you look at what man has done to argue about right and wrong, if right and wrong is simply all relative, there's no absolutes. There is no truth that's absolute. There is, if your conscience is telling you to do, or you think it's wrong to do something, you should fight that urge, because that's just the old way of doing things, and you should go against that and do what feels good. That kind of mindset today is rampant. Even that idea of we know something is right, we know are wrong. Man knows that, and now we've even made it so much that we call good evil and evil good. We have completely, all you gotta do is read Romans chapter 1. You can see how man has done that. So man has seared their consciences right now. And we see that done in so many ways. Again and again and again, we've seen how man has seared their consciences, gone against what God has written in their hearts, and rebelled against that. And we in the U.S. here are guilty of that. And it's a horrible thing. What we have excused and made okay, the very thing that we know is wrong. So, personal restraint, that conscience that God has given to us, that's the first thing that's supposed to restrain us. Now, secondly, is the parental restraint. Now, this is rather simple, really. The idea that our parents are given to us by God to discipline us. Now, the idea of how that discipline comes out, the political correctness of the Proverbs, it's not there. Let's just put it that way. When you read Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 15, folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline drives it far from him. Now, I don't want to debate what kind of discipline is supposed to come about. That's not what this is necessarily about, although I think there is a bit of that. But the reality is that when we have taken away the responsibility of parents to discipline their child, and folks, I work with a lot of parents with their children, and the biggest challenge that I see with parents is when parents try to be their child's buddy. They try to make the child's life as comfortable and as perfect as possible, when they don't allow their child to face the consequences of their actions, when they don't discipline their child, becomes a problem. So that's one side of it, but that's just one side of it, because we also see today the really sad truth of how many children are born into homes that do not have a mother and a father. And when you look at the stats, this is so cut and dry. Why politicians don't talk about this, why this isn't talked about by social services, why this isn't talked about as a major issue. Because, folks, it is. I know I talk about this on Father's Day. I think just on Father's Day I talked about that. But you go back and look at the stats, research it yourself, and see the stats for what happens to kids that aren't born into a family with a mother and a father. The stats are crazy. If we look at that and follow through with that, and yet what is going on even right now? People calling for the dissolution of the family. That we don't need families, we need communities raising children. That is some organizations, I'll call it out, Black Lives Matter, research it, do some reading on it. That organization is even calling for the dissolution of the family because they believe it is a racist organization, the family. That it's not supposed to be raised. This is a Western idea that needs to be rooted out. Folks, this is God's idea that needs to be upheld. And that whole mindset of doing away with the family is just another chip away at doing things God's way. And it's another chip away of the parental discipline that is supposed to be protecting our society, guiding it towards God instead of away from God. That's God's plan, the family, and discipline. Can't be just a family. I talked about that the first part. It's got to be a family that practices discipline for their child so their child will grow up into what they need to be. And today, if you believe, and see step one here, or my first point, but if you believe that man is okay on their own, that they don't, that they're not sinners, that they don't need discipline, then you believe your child is not a sinner and they're perfect little angels. And that dictates how you parent them. That's a problem. But we understand that man is sinful. Man has a sin nature. Man needs correction. Man needs God. Man needs parents to provide that discipline early on. We have to understand the importance of discipline. Discipline, I would argue, is important for every area of life, to practice discipline. And for our children, we've got to show it to them. Right now, I think we're seeing the results of children that were left to themselves, coddled, catered to, and that's what we're dealing with today. Part of my generation. So, 2 restraints: the conscience, we've seared it, the things that we're willing to do as a society today, that we're calling good, that we're calling okay. Some people, the idea of abortion, there's just one sliver of an example that even Christians could argue that it's okay to take a life of a baby that God has created. God, the author of life. that we could say, well, in some cases, God is the life giver, not man. But we have seared it to allow this to happen by the millions. We've been seared, or the conscience of the collective we of the U.S. has been seared. When you think of the societal restraint, we're talking about the government here. Remember what we read in Romans 13, let every person be subject to governing authorities. There's no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. And those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who's in authority? Then do what is good, and you'll receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. God's plan is that first our own bodies, our own hearts would have his law written on it so that we would know right from wrong, that he gives us parents to instill that in us, to remind us of that, to discipline us when we go away from that. Then he gives us broader the idea of the government, to remind us right and wrong, to punish wrong in a different way than our parents punish wrong, but to punish wrong, to reward good. That's the government's job. What have we done with government recently? Well, first off, I think you could argue the politicians, unfortunately, many of them have made a joke out of the government's responsibilities and have completely abdicated that role because of their own greed, their own desire for power, their own lack of discipline. But then we see even further than that. Now we have a problem of those that are specifically responsible for being God's hand of judgment upon those who are doing bad, the police officers. And what are we saying today? Defund the police. We don't like what they're doing. We don't like that they're coming after. Now I understand. I'm not trying to make light of the political issue going on there. But folks, it's a problem. What have we seen in these cities that have already started to defund the police? The cities that have taken away the societal restraint that's God's purpose and God's plan. I'm not arguing. I don't want to argue and say that police are, if you don't have a certain amount of police, you're not following God's plan. That's not my point at all. But clearly, our society today in the U.S., much of it has taken God's plan for reward good, punish evil, and we've turned that on its head. And we're going to continue to see that, unfortunately. Unfortunately, right now we have police officers and even sheriffs that are resigning because they simply can't work. I can't imagine trying to go into become a police officer right now. I can't imagine that. With the way that they are treated, and I just can't imagine the pressure that you would be under for that. We have turned the head there. And even today, the idea of, or last week, last Monday, last Sunday night, what was going on in Chicago? More destruction. Very little consequence. It's a sad, sad thing. So, but that's God's plan, though, is that we would use the government, his appointed, what God has put into place, to restrain again. And man has pushed back on that. And then finally, the church. God has given the church to be a light. We are supposed to be restraining. What are we called? It calls it Matthew 5 the salt. That's the idea. A preserver, a restrainer of the evil. Paul talks about this in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 14. Do all things without grumbling and disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as light in the world. What's our job? Now, I love this point that Paul's making is that we live in a world that's twisted, crooked. They're in bad shape. But what are we supposed to be doing? Showing them the light, showing them the way to go, helping them get untwisted. And we know, by the way, that's only done through the gospel. Our social programs from churches are not going to do it. The gospel does. And so when we look at that, the church is supposed to step in there and say, okay, society, stop. This is wrong. So what has our society done today? Where's the U.S. going with that? I'm thankful for the freedoms we have right now that proclaim the gospel. But folks, we have seen, even during this time of pandemic, of the idea of what is essential and what is not. And the fact that churches have until courts have been getting involved because of our Constitution, to show that, well, according to the Constitution, the rights, the freedom of worship is a big one. It's in there. But in general, our society has been trying to say, no, it's not. Governors have. Now, we could debate all day, and I don't really want to debate that at all, about the responsibility of the church in this time of this pandemic. I understand that. I don't want to make light of that. But I do think it's important to show, I think the most appalling case was Nevada, that churches couldn't be open no matter how many they were allowing in their building, but casinos could. That makes zero sense of what it is that's supposed to be protected by our nation, by the Constitution, and by what God has designed as being a restrainer of what is good. The church has been placed there to be a light. That's God's plan. To restrain the evil, promote the good. The church is supposed to be proclaiming that. I would also argue that, unfortunately, today the reality is the message of the gospel in so many churches, it's what they're doing isn't essential. Shame on the church. Proclaim the gospel. So, but those four things, God's designed, God has set up, our hearts, the consciences that we have, God's put in place to restrain evil. God has designed parents to discipline their child to restrain evil. God has provided the government to reward good, to punish evil. Why? To restrain evil. No one wants to live in a society with no laws. Even those that are calling for it right now, they don't really want that. They want to set up their own laws that will benefit them. But they don't want anarchy. They want anarchy until they can put their own government in. That's for sure. God's given us these things for his purpose. God's given us the church to proclaim the gospel. That is the true restrainer of wicked. That's our job. And folks, when we interact with people about what's going on, we can shake our head and wring our hands, or we can say, you know what, we've got to do a better job of reminding people what God has put on their hearts, reminding people the importance of the family, the importance of discipline within the family, the importance of government, and supporting a government who rewards good and punishes evil. Our government's not always been perfect at that. We need to do better, as good as we possibly can. We as a church have a responsibility in all of this. The world may not want anything to do with God's transforming truth of his word. That doesn't mean we quit preaching. It means we preach even more. So I wanted to share that with you. I thought those were really interesting. I hope you'll think about that even this week. Think about your response to those 4 things. And I appreciate John MacArthur sharing those. And I hope that's a help. All right? You all have a great week. Let's continue to proclaim the gospel. Be the light. Be the salt.